Magandang umaga po sa lahat, Sir Rico, at sa lahat ng classmates na nandito ngayon. For this morning, I'd like to talk about the active resistance, particularly in Luzon. And I was actually, in coming up with this report, I was trying to find a way to limit the scope of my report because there's a lot of ground to cover, especially in terms of the resistance against the Japanese, not only in Luzon, but in the rest of the country. If you are going to look actually at the repository in Pivao, the archival collection in Pivao, you will be confronted by 1,000 folders, literally more than 1,000 folders. So there's quite a lot of ground to cover by just looking at the archival collection. So the best thing that I did was actually to go back to the secondary literature and try to look for an argument which I can engage using the documentary evidence that I had courtesy of Pivao. So, of course, the next thing I did was to go back to Teodoro Agoncillo's The Fateful Years because it's one of the most, should I say, detailed account on the active resistance. Of course, it's not perfect, it's not complete, it's not exhaustive, but he presents an argument there that I would like to engage this morning. So with that, I'd like to start with a quote from Teodoro Agoncillo's The Fateful Years. So he writes in the second volume of The Fateful Years, Japan's Adventure in the Philippines, 1941 to 45, that with the fall of the island fortress in May 1942, the Filipinos ended their passive resistance to the enemy and began active resistance. So here in this quote, we can see that he posits a linear model, so it seems, to temporarily map the end of passive resistance and the beginning of active resistance against the Japanese. So he sets the demarcation line where it started and where it ended on the fall of the Corregidor Island in May 1942. He goes on to clarify his argument by saying, or more accurately, the Filipinos employed both passive and active resistance. Those in the lowlands and in the urban centers continued their passive resistance, while those in the remote areas shifted to active resistance. However, documentary evidence suggests that there had already been active resistance movements even before the fall of Corregidor on May 6, 1942. And Agoncillo actually cites these pieces of evidence to show us that there had been active resistance movements even before May 6, 1942. And there had been operations as well, not just the organization of these groups or formation, but also operations in Luzon, particularly the civilian ones and also the unsurrendered military units, beginning in as early as December 1941. So I'd like to present 4 counter-examples to Agoncillo's argument. So I'd like to visualize for us Agoncillo's argument here. No? So he sets the demarcation line on May 6, the fall of Corregidor, and then he says before that, it has always been passive resistance. And after that, it has been active resistance in remote areas and passive resistance in urban centers. But for this morning, I argue that there had already been active resistance movements even before the fall of Corregidor. And later, I would like to offer an explanation why Agoncillo may have, what Agoncillo may have considered in arguing such, no? The argument that we just interrogated. Now, here is my outline of discussion. Of course, we have already interrogated Agoncillo's oft-cited and oft-repeated model of passive and active resistance against the Japanese. And I'd like to also talk about the types of resistance groups, particularly the ones that Sir Rico discussed in Volume 7 of Kasaysayan. He cites, I believe, 4 examples of resistance groups. And I'd like to talk about, actually, ano lang to? 1, 2, 3, yeah, 5. 5 active resistance movements against the Japanese in Luzon, not 4 pala, 5. So I will be talking about the Ablan Madamba guerrilla group of Ilocos Norte, the Cagayan guerrilla force that was organized by Governor Marcelo Aduru, the Filipino-American irregular troops, which actually operated in various Tagalog provinces. I also talk about 2 guerrilla units that were based here in the Bicol region. We have the Tangkong Vaca guerrilla unit and the Camp Isarog guerrillas in the province I just mentioned. And of course, finally, I'd like to go back to Agoncillo's argument and offer everyone an observation, if not a hypothesis, why Agoncillo argued the linear model I just presented to all of us. So let's go first to the types of resistance groups. According to James Villanueva, in a very recent dissertation he defended, I think at Ohio State University, he wrote that the guerrillas came from all walks of life and elements of society. Sir Rico, I believe, delivered a lecture on the Wachi guerrillas, so Chinese, kasama yung Chinese. Nandyan din, syempre, yung mga peasants and labor groups in Central Luzon. We have also seen women who are part of the guerrilla movement. And in my example later, I will show you that even the indigenous peoples are also included in the war or the resistance movement against the Japanese. So according to Sir Rico, in volume 7 of Kasaysayan, there were different types of resistance groups. First, you have the unsurrendered military elements. So most likely these are the ones who had been cut off from the fighting in Bataan. That's one example. And then of course, number 2, you have the peasant and labor groups, particularly in Central Luzon. Now, these movements have adopted a more socialist, communist ideology. No? So nakita natin yan sa example ng Hukbalaha. Number 3, and I'm most interested in this one because we are civilians and I'm very interested in what they did during the war. And it's very fascinating that many ordinary people organized themselves to resist the Japanese even before the battle in Bataan and the battle in Corregidor. So I'd like to also discuss some civilian groups that were, number 1, led by pre-war political figures. So you see a picture of Wenceslao Vinsons to your right. Maybe Jeff Asuncion can talk more about this later during the open forum. Vinsons is the governor of Camarines Norte, or was the governor of Camarines Norte, and he led a guerrilla unit there as well until his death. And there were also civilian groups that were led by ordinary men and women, as in civilians. Merong taxi driver, merong miner sa Benguet. No? These are ordinary men and women. There are even students who had to discontinue their studies because their schools have closed. So later, may mga makikita tayong example when I discuss, especially the Tangkong Vaca guerrilla unit here in Camarines Sur. And finally, there were also those who are belligerent or rogue, yung mga belligerent guerrillas, who are guilty of looting, murdering, even raping fellow Filipinos. So may isang example mamaya na ipapakita ko na dinidisiplina actually ng guerrilla unit niya yung mga belligerent guerrillas in their province. So we will see that later. So it's important to note before we dive into the guerrilla units that I'll be talking about, it's very important to note the Japanese landings in mainland Luzon that took place, this is just my approximation, between December 8, 1941 to January 8, 1942. And I hope the map I have here is quite an approximate depiction of all those landings, but there are very important landings that we have to take note. The one in Apari, the one in Lingayen, the one in Legazpi, and the one somewhere, I think this is in Atimonan, if I'm not mistaken. The arrow that you see here, this is somewhere in Quezon province. So it's very important to take note of these landings and also the advances that ensued, because we will be able to contextualize further the resistance movements. What were they resisting in the first place? Or when those resistance movements began in the first place. So it would be more clear to us. So let's proceed to the counterexamples to Teodoro Agoncillo's claim, which is the active resistance movements against the Japanese in Luzon. The very first example or counterexample that I'd like to talk about would be the Ablan Madamba guerrilla group of northern Luzon. You might remember that a few years ago, there was a Congressman Ablan. He's actually the son of Governor Ablan of Ilocos Norte. I think kamamatay lang ni Congressman Ablan a few years ago. So he's the son of the guerrilla leader and Governor Ablan. So this unit was organized, obviously, by Governor Roque Ablan and Lieutenant Feliciano Madamba in January 1942. Take note, this is 5 months before the fall of Corregidor. So Roque Ablan Sr., I say senior because junior, yung kamamatay lang na congressman, was born in Lawag, Ilocos Norte on August 9, 1906. He's actually an alumnus of the University of the Philippines as he graduated in 1929 and received his degree in philosophy and also received his degree in law the following year. I think he also got admitted into the Philippine bar in the same year, 1930. Ablan was elected governor of Ilocos. He was elected twice, 1937 and then again in 1941. And when the Japanese came to Ilocos, he refused to submit. He refused to surrender. So he organized a unit together with Feliciano Madamba, who was a lieutenant in the Philippine Army, but his unit has been cut off from Bataan. So he was not able to join the fighting there, and he just decided to join forces with Governor Ablan. Now, one of the first things that Ablan did was to move the seat of his government, the provincial capital, from Lawag to a barrio bordering Apayao. Now, it wasn't really clear to me which barrio or which town this was in. So, pwede nating i-infer na baka one of these towns could be those locations, pwedeng sa Nueva Eira, Carasi, or sa Vintar, kasi ito naman yung mga nagbo-border sa Apayao. Now, on January 27, Ablan and Madamba, joined by their followers, went to Solsona in Ilocos Norte. So you see on the map the present-day boundaries or borders of Solsona to gather arms and ammunition, and they actually gathered 300 rifles, 12 machine rifles, and automatic rifles. They also gathered 6 machine guns and several boxes of ammunition. This is from Teodoro Agoncillo. And I also read this somewhere, I think in a letter by the wife of Governor Ablan, si Mrs. Manuela Ablan. I was able to find the letter in the Pivao archival collection. So binanggit niya doon kung ano yung mga ginather na armas ng kanyang asawa early in 1942. So Governor Ablan put Lieutenant Madamba in charge of forming a military unit. This is from Bernard Norling. I think he wrote a book on the guerrillas of Northern Luzon in 1999. So the group began their operations the following day by ambushing a Japanese patrol. 50 Japanese soldiers were estimated to have died in the ambush. So we can infer here that one of their motivations in organizing the unit was to disrupt Japanese operations in their area. And there were also former soldiers who failed to join the USAFI in Bataan who joined the Ablan Madamba unit. So lumaki yung bilang ng miyembro, ng mga kasapi ng kanyang unit. If I'm not mistaken, umabot yata sa 1,100 at its peak yung lakas ng unit ni Ablan at ni Madamba. Sabi dito, the group grew into a full-fledged resistance unit and was also able to impose discipline to independent guerrillas. Ito na yung sinasabi ko kanina, no? They were able to control the belligerent and the rogue guerrillas who had committed acts of brigandage, murder, and rape against their fellow Filipinos, at least in the Ilocos region. You know? So ito yung isa sa mga motivations din kung bakit inorganize ni Ablan ito to maintain peace and order. Kasi nagkakagulo na kahit yung mga kapwa Pilipino ay may mga crimes na rin na kinocommit against their fellow Filipinos. So they had to instill discipline and restore order. So what Ablan did was to divide Ilocos Norte into sectors of 1 to 3 towns, headed or supervised by a guerrilla leader. According to Agoncillo, Ablan created an intelligence section as well as a counter-propaganda machine. So maybe later, Edsel can also talk about this during his report. And after the fall of Corregidor on May 6, the Japanese sent soldiers and even collaborators, including Artemio Ricarte, to Northern Luzon to convince Ablan to surrender and collaborate with the Japanese. Of course, as one can expect, Ablan did not surrender. Now, according to a report that was filed, I think, in 1947 by 3 soldiers, First Lieutenant Charles Homewood, Howard de Silva, and William Macmillan, the unit's primary engagements after the first ambush in Solsona were the following. So tingnan nyo na lang po sa mapa sa kanang bahagi ng screen kung nasaan itong mga bayan na ito. So they had operations in Bana sometime in February, in Pidig, in Bacara, Bobon, Badok, and again in Bacara. Hindi ko nahanap kung nasaan yung Barnay. Hinahanap ko siya, sabi ko baka baryo siya or sitio. Hinanap ko siya sa historical data papers but to no avail. So kung may Ilocano dito who can enlighten us kung saan yung Barnay, that would be very helpful later. So ito yung mga major operations according to the report, no, by the three soldiers I just mentioned. So mapapansin natin dito, no, may dalawang operations sila na nangyari before the fall of Corregidor on May 6. So ito yung first 3 pages ng report na sinasabi ko. No? I was able to gather this from one of the folders in Pivao's archival collection. And this is actually a discussion of, or a narrative report, more of a narrative report of the Ablan guerrilla forces. So makikita nyo sa first page yung mga nakakausap ng tatlong sundalo, yung mga in-interview nila, sino yung mga pinagkunan nila ng datos when it comes to Ablan and his guerrilla forces. So you will see the second and third pages there. So it's more of a narrative of the Ablan guerrilla forces. Makikita nyo pala dito yung mga operations. Ano? Ito yung binabanggit ko kanina sa second page, letter C. All right, let's proceed. Now, the group's major battle actually took place in Solsona on November 8, 1942. A few months later, they suffered tremendous losses because the Japanese really began targeting Ablan's camp. And he became a fugitive because of that battle on January 28th, and he lost contact with his men. According to various accounts and reports, he was last seen alive in a battle in Pidig on February 5, 1943. And on the other hand, Madamba surrendered to the Japanese on April 10, 1943. So later we will see what happened to his unit. Actually, nag-disintegrate siya according to multiple reports. But in another account, I think it was Agoncillo's account, he said that they merged and joined forces with another group in northern Luzon. So may kinalaman yan dun sa susunod na resistance movement na tatalakay ito. So after the war, unfortunately, the Ablan Madamba group was not recognized as a guerrilla unit by the Guerrilla Affairs Division. No, at yung Philricom I think it's a Philippine Ryukus Command, Sir Rico, no? Philippine Ryukus Command. So yan yung gusto sabihin ng Philricom. And yung dahilan kung bakit hindi sila nabigyan ng recognition are as follows. No? Actually, sinamarize ito ni Mrs. Manuela Ablan for us. So thank you, Mrs. Ablan. First, the Ablan Madamba group did not have continuity of activity and organization because it dissolved after the death of Ablan and perhaps after the surrender and consequent death of Madamba. And it was also said that it was not a quote true military unit because there were no members who were members of the USAFE. So hindi talaga sila kinilala bilang isang military unit. So itong asawa or widow na si Mrs. Manuela Ablan ay nag-appeal to reconsider the case of the Ablan Madamba unit in I think in a letter to Wallace Hansen dated October 16, 1947. You will see the letter on the right side of your screens. So nag-appeal siya to reconsider the decision. But ultimately, they sustained the decision to not recognize the Ablan guerrilla unit as a recognized or ano ba tawag dyan, as a legitimate guerrilla unit. So makikita po natin dito yung ilang figures. The one to your left is the first page of Ablan's letter to Wallace Haynes. And the one to your right, you will see there the first page of Wallace Haynes' reply, dated October 28th. Actually, it's supposed to be October, not September, 1947. So nakuha ko ito sa folder ng Ablan Guerrilla Forces sa Pivao Archival Collection. So ultimately, Second Lieutenant Raul Diaz de Rivera ruled that the decision of the Guerrilla Affairs Division be sustained. So dalawang beses actually nag-decide noong 1946 yung Guerrilla Division Yun nga lang, inappeal siya. Parang may mga konsehal, kahit yung mayor ng Ilocos Norte nag-appeal, yung asawa ni Ablan nag-appeal. Pero ultimately, they decided to sustain their initial decisions. So Diaz de Rivera recommended thus that this report constitute the final action by this headquarters on the Ablan's guerrilla forces, otherwise known as the Ilocos guerrillas. So you will see the quote in the letter that's on the right side of your screens. So these are, I think, pages from the same folder, and you will see there the enlisted men in Ablan's unit. So talagang marami, no? May mga lieutenant, may mga corporal, may mga captain, maraming private, obviously. Hindi ko na nga nasama dito yung iba kasi nga umabot sa 1,100 yung estimates ng members ni Ablan sa kanyang guerrilla unit. So, let me now proceed to another Northern Luzon resistance movement, and that is the Cagayan guerrilla forces. So, bakit ganyan yung itsura ng slide? Kasi may mga movements yan, no? Yung Cagayan guerrilla forces, nag-merge Apayao later on, and later on, nag-merge sila dun sa iba pang mga Northern Luzon resistance movements. Kasama na doon yung natitira sa mga tauhan ni Ablan. At nagi silang United States Forces in the Philippines, or USFIP, NL, the Northern Luzon. I'm not sure what it's called, command or brigade of the USFIP. So, forgive me because my treatment of the next two examples would not be the same with the first and the last examples that I'll be talking about. So at least I'm able to give us a little overview of the resistance movements. So this is a precursor to the US forces in the Philippines, no? Northern Luzon, as I suggested in the title. And this was organized by another pre-war political figure, Governor Marcelo Aduru, who moved the capital from Tuguegarao to the town of Tuaw. So you will see that in the political map on the right side, after the Japanese landed in Apari in December 1941. So Apari is a town of Cagayan. So this is another crucial area to examine because one of the landings that took place in December was in the province of Cagayan. According to Agoncillo, Aduru gathered his loyal officials, police force, and even a few USAFE personnel to comprise the Cagayan guerrilla force. Now, it may be remembered, actually, kung tumitingin kayo sa Wikipedia ng mga Senate elections in past years in light of the recent Senate and presidential elections, mapapansin nyo na si Aduru ay tumakbo rin para sa Senado, but unfortunately, he lost in 1949. So, sinasabi ni Abinales at Amoroso kasi na yung mga maraming political figures ay they actually capitalized on their guerrilla experience during the war. So marami sa kanila, kung mapapansin nyo, ang tumakbo din sa ilang elective positions. No? Isang magandang halimbawa yan si Aduru, yun nga lang natalo siya noong 1949. Pero may isang taga-Norte actually nanalo noong 1949 as a congressman of Ilocos Norte. And he claimed that he's actually part of the guerrilla movement, and we know who that man was, Ferdinand Marcos, so 1949. In the 1959, he became the most popular senatorial candidate, and he was number 1 in the senatorial race. So makikita natin na ginamit nila as political capital yung kanilang experience, or at least kay Marcos, at least yung dinidepict niyang experience niya sa gera laban sa mga Hapon. So this is Marcelo Aduru, the one to your right. It didn't take long before Aduru's unit grew in number because he was joined by military officers, actual military men. So si Ralph Prager, si Francis Camp, and 3 other American soldiers. And according to Agoncillo, the unit soon became a menace to the Japanese. Bakit menace? Kasi yung tina-target nila ay yung mga airport at yung mga tulay. No, yung Japanese hangar at Tuguegarao, it's actually one of their first operations in January of 1942. So yung mga eroplanong lumalapag sa Tuguegarao, they were destroying it. They were cutting off the bridges as well that connects certain towns to Tuguegarao. So this was the purpose of, at least initially, of his guerrilla force. No? So you will see there the first, at least 2 of the first operations of the group. So they raided an airport, They destroyed a bridge, and they also raided a Japanese hangar or kung saan tinatago yung mga aircraft, no? Saan nakaparking yung mga aircraft. So ito yung unang operations ng kanilang grupo. Now, forgive the picture because I couldn't find a more accurate one, but this is just a picture in 1945. It's not a picture of necessarily the Cagayan Guerrilla Force. Wala na akong mahanap eh. So nilagay ko sa baba kung ano yung picture na yan. Pero at least sa norte pa rin. Now, even after the fall of Corregidor on May 6, 1942, the Cagayan Guerrilla Force continued their operations. So Aduru was inducted into the US Army as a major on July 4, 1942. Now, Prager and Aduro's units were merged under a single command, ito na yung sinasabi ko kanina, at naging na siyang Cagayan Apayao Guerrilla Force. Now, Aduro was appointed chieftain according to Agoncillo. I don't know what he meant by chieftain. Hindi ko alam kung legit pang rango yun. And Prager was executive officer. No? Ito yung account ni Agoncillo sa The Fateful Years. Now, on October 1, 1942, Martin Moses, another American military man, conferred with several guerrilla groups in northern Luzon. And he actually announced that he was assuming command. Now, the groups that he conferred with are as follows. So of course, nandiyan yung Ablan Guerrilla Group, yung unit ni Prager sa Apayao, yung unit ni Enriquez sa Nueva Vizcaya, George Barnett in La Union, Robert Lapham and Charles Cushing in Pangasinan, and Nueva Ecija, respectively, and Dennis Bulintas in Benguet. So ito yung mga grupo na initially na-consolidate into the USFIPNL, or United States Forces in the Philippines. I think may mga nadagdag pa later on. I'm not so sure kung ano yung mga grupong yun, pero hindi ko na kasi siya na-examine pa, no? Because it came, I think, in 1943. So, may sinasabi rin si Agoncillo that the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Noble and Lieutenant Colonel Martin Moses, ito na yata yun, at Aduro's hideout in Magabobo, Ilocos Norte in 1943, led to the consolidation. Nag-announce lang siya muna, pero yung consolidation talaga ay nangyari noong 1943. At ito yung mga naatasang mga opisyal, no, ng USFIPNL. So yung G4 ay si Aduro, G3 si Noble, G2 si Prager, at yung G1 ay si Thomas Jones. Sa totoo lang, medyo naguluhan na ako kay Agoncillo kasi parang dalawa yung sinasabi niya eh. Parang 1942 and 1943. And then I made sense of it last night na nag-announce lang pala ng 42. But the consolidation actually took place in January or February 1943. There's a lot to unpack in Agoncillo's books. So, ito yung nahanap ko sa volume 2 ng The Fateful Years. Okay, let's now go to the third example or counterexample. Filipino-American irregular troops, or the FAIT, and their network of guerrilla units. Medyo may bias ako dito sa Laguna kasi ang binasa ko talaga ay yung article ni Sir Noy Makapinlak ng Lasal. I think he wrote an article and presented it in 2016, published it in the Journal of History. So makikita natin yan maya-maya lang. So the Filipino-American Irregular Troops was founded by Colonel Hugh Strawn, a retired American officer. And he organized this one according to Sir Noy's paper in January 1942. Again, months before the fall of Corregidor. And then Strawn, of course, was division commander of the FAIT. No? They operated in various Tagalog provinces, including the present-day Quezon Province, Cavite, Laguna, Rizal, as well as Manila and present-day Marikina. The 1st Brigade was headed by Colonel Marcos V. Agustin, and he was dispatched in various locations in Tayabas, yung Tayabas Province, Cavite, Manila, and Marikina. I think they concentrated their forces somewhere in Mauban and also in Tiao. I'm not so sure why, but nandun yung concentration ng kanilang pwersa. Now, the 2nd Brigade is more of interest to me because I worked in Laguna for 2 years. So medyo familiar sa akin yung mga sinasabi ni Sir Noy dito. So according to Makapinlak, this brigade, yung 2nd Brigade, was headed by Colonel Emilio Acosta, and it covered Laguna. So this brigade worked closely with local guerrilla groups such as the Laguna Intelligence Forces, which was established in Binyan shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And we also have the 1st Laguna Brigade, founded in Nagcarlan in May 1942 by Guillermo Naga, a master sergeant of the USAFE, and Heriberto Zumbilya, a soldier and inductee into the United States Army. So ito yung network ng mga guerrilla units ng FATE, no? Ng 2nd Brigade ng FATE. And the 3rd Brigade was headed by Colonel Manuel Diquip, and he was assigned in Manila, while the 4th Brigade was led by Colonel Junicio Banting Jr., and they were dispatched in the Rizal province. So, according to a report signed by Victor Schumacher, again, this is from Tivao, Strawn was eventually captured on August 6, 1943, and the unit that he formed disintegrated. Now, after the war, unfortunately, FATE did not receive guerrilla recognition for their resistance activities before the fall of Corregidor. Sorry, nakulangan ng words dun sa baba. But it's supposed to say for not having continuity in their activities. No? Ito yung dahilan na sinight ni Schumacher sa kanyang report. So, just like the Ablan Madamba group, they were not given guerrilla status or recognition after the war. So, again, hindi pare-pareho ang treatment ko, no? Let's now proceed to my last 2 examples. Pinagsama ko na siya dahil nag-coalesce din ang dalawang grupong ito sa Naga in 1942, no, when they captured Naga from the Japanese. Actually, that's 80 years ago. So, I'm going to talk about Tangkong Vaca Guerrilla Unit as well as the Camp Isarog guerrillas here in the province of Camarines Sur. So nag-norte na tayo, nag-Tagalog provinces na tayo. So meron din tayong Bicol region. So hopefully represented, wala lang yata mga Kapampangan. Pero represented hopefully yung mga parts ng Luzon or regions ng Luzon. So let's go first to the Tangkong Vaca Guerrilla Unit or the TVGU in Camarines Sur. It was organized by a civilian, a 33-year-old civilian, and an affluent man from Canacman, Camarines Sur, named Elias V. Madrid. Here in Camarines Sur, he was considered a dakulang tao or malaking tao. Pag sinabi malaking tao, mayaman, maraming properties, maraming lupa. So si Elias Madrid, yung naging, as you can expect, naging financier ng TVGU sa Camsur. Wala siyang alam sa pakikipaglaban, wala siyang alam sa taktika de guerra or sa war tactics. So he decided to invite other members to be part of the TVGU. Now on March 8, 1942, together with Elias's brothers Modesto and Policarpio, as well as his cohorts Raimundo Martinez and Leon Aureus, they visited Juan Miranda in his house at Barrio San Nicolas. Now later I will show you where San Nicolas is. And it was actually Miranda's 30th birthday. I cannot imagine on your 30th birthday, some group of men will come to your house and invite you to go to war with them. No, I just celebrated my 30th last March as well. So I cannot imagine what Miranda had to go through during his 30th birthday. So they brought up the idea for an armed resistance and to command the group, to which Miranda agreed. No? Pumayag kagad, tinanggap niya to lead the TVGU. Now, Madrid designated Leon Aureus as executive officer, while he opted to be the finance officer and as well as financier. So to your right, you will see the pictures of Miranda, the one in the right, and the one to your left is Leon Aureus. Actually, Aureus became if I'm not mistaken, a congressman after the war, and he's the one responsible for making Naga a chartered city. So 1948, I think pinapirmahan niya kay Elpidio Quirino yung kanyang bill na pinadrinuhan or na sponsor to make Naga a chartered city. They also inducted some political figures in the province, including Damaso Requejo, who was the municipal mayor of Canacman. Hanggang ngayon, may mga Requejo pa sa Canacman na naging mayor. He was inducted as TVGU's intelligence officer. Siyempre kasi alam niyo yung nangyayari sa kanyang bayan. No? So the next day, they didn't waste their time. Aureus, Martinez, and other members went to Libmanan. I will show you these places in a bit, to recruit other notable members like Honorato Ostillo, Nicolas Peñaredondo, and Elias Villaseñor. Who is of interest to me here is Nicolas Peña-Redondo because he wrote, if I'm not mistaken, poems to document the operations of the Tangkong Baka. Sayang, I wasn't able to access that, but it's here in the O'Brien collection at the Ateneo de Naga University. Siguro pag nakuha ko, isi-share ko na lang sa inyo via email in case you're interested. Pero may mga sinulat siyang tula, no, to account for their operations here in Camarines Sur. So, the membership into the unit was not limited to men. It also included women from auxiliary groups in the towns of Gainza and Pamplona. One notable member na para sa akin dapat talaga maisulat na yung biography niya ay si Crescenciana Anciano, who was a student at the Colegio de Santa Isabel. She was drafted as a lieutenant and was eventually ranked captain and commanding officer of TVGU's Company L of the 3rd Infantry Unit based in the town of Gainza. She actually had a very moving speech. You can see that in my notes. Sometime in 1943, she delivered a speech to the daughters of Tandang Sora, who were composed of medical volunteers, among others. Ito yung auxiliary unit ng TVGU. So with much vigor, Anciana urged her fellow Bicolanas, and she said, "Now our country is at war. She needs our help. Let us do away with egoism. Let us not think too much of ourselves, but on the other hand, let us try to sacrifice every bit of our enjoyment and pleasure for the sake of the group and for the love of country." So she's a student. Yung nakakabilib doon. Estudyante siya sa Colegio de Santa Isabel. But of course, the picture you see on your right, matanda na siya dyan. Hindi siya yan yung estudyante pa. Baka nagtataka kayo, baka ang tanda niya naman yung estudyante pa siya. Nung tumanda na lang siya. Actually, may kinikwento pa yung tatay ko na naabutan niya pa yung time na nagtitinda pa sa Naga City Market si Crescenciana Anciano nung matanda na siya. So, I'm actually looking for her descendants here in Camarines Sur, sa Gainza lalo. Nung nag-launch kami ng Bicol History Journal, may isang descendant actually nag-attend. So, humihingi ako sa kanya ng mga leads kung sino yung pwedeng kausapin sa family niya. So, we hope to pursue this eventually, no? Para yung mga women mabigyan din ng boses when it comes to the resistance movements. Okay, bakit Tangkong Baka? Anong gusto sabihin nun in the first place? It's actually named after a mountain in the town of Libmanan. So you will see on your right the map, or at least a portion of Camarines Sur, and this is Libmanan. The one to your left side, yan yung Libmanan. Tapos yung green, yung dark green na portion, that is the Tangkong Baka Mountain. So yung San Nicolas, tanong ko lang po sir, nakikita po ba yung cursor ko? Can you see my cursor or the mouse pointer?
Not really.
Hindi po siya nakita, no? Yeah, but salamat po sir. But anyway, you will see there an island, virtually an island in the middle of the picture. That is where San Nicolas is. Until now, Barrio San Nicolas pa rin ang tawag sa kanya. So it's in an island, no? Siguro for the present generation, magtataka sila, Kanaaman, paano nakapunta ng Libmanan? Kasi yung orientation nila, yung kalsada. Pero pag tiningnan niyo yung geographic location ng San Nicolas, Kanaaman, it's actually right beside Libmanan, no? And it's connected because of the Bicol River, the meandering Bicol River. So yan yung geographic context ng Tangkong Baka Guerrilla Unit. So ito yung ilan sa mga operations nila according to Aureus in his Journal of Events and Activities. Their first operation was to disrupt Japanese advance in Pamplona on March 20, 1942. So Pamplona is right here in the lower middle section of the picture. And later, on April 1, 1942, they demolished a rice mill owned by a certain Doña Flaviana Ocampo in Libmanan, which was being used to mill thousands of cavans of rice to support the Japanese army. So, kung nagtataka kayo, paano nakapunta ng Libmanan yung mga galing sa Legazpi? So of course, via the Albay Gulf, dumaan sila sa right side ng Camsur at pumasok sila via the San Miguel Bay on top, tapos sa Bicol River dumaan. So ito yung at least yung anong tawag niyan, transportation over water, no? Kasi wala pang magagandang kalsada at least during that time. Sobrang may hirapan i-transport. So ito yung ilan sa mga operations nila. Ulit na yata ito. Okay, on March 13, again, there's also an operation by a certain Jaime Sinardes to blow up the concrete bridge in Libmanan in order to cut the overland transportation between Libmanan and Naga. So this is according to Jose Barameda's book in 2007. And another operation took place in Barrio Tinigiban in Pamplona. There's Pamplona on March 20, and it was also headed by Miranda. So these are just some of the examples of their early operations. All right, so naulit na yata ito. So this is a beautiful picture of the Ateneo de Naga during the war. I believe this was taken in 1943, and I was able to obtain a copy from the Ateneo de Naga University archives. The attack on Naga has actually been planned by the TVGU as early as March 22nd. But they thought that it was premature at that point, and they dropped the idea as quickly as it had been raised, according to Barameda. Now, there's another guerrilla unit in the province called the Camp Isarog Guerrillas. Again, they were named after a mountain, Camp Isarog Guerrillas. And they were based in what is now the Partido District, yung 4th Congressional District. Pag hinanap niyo sa Wikipedia, may mapa doon. So that is where they were based, yung Camp Isarog Guerrillas. And they were led by Faustino Flor and Teofilo Padua. And they actually were plotting an attack on Naga after their operation to seize the town of Iriga, which is 45 minutes to 1 hour away from Naga if you drive it. No? 45 to 1 hour lang siya. So by the dawn of May 1, 1942, hundreds of Camp Isarog guerrillas were already positioned in the outskirts of Naga, almost parallel to the Bicol River. Later on, I will show you a picture of pre-war Naga so that we can actually imagine where they were positioned. Now, Flor sent Seferino Francisco to Panakman that early morning to relay to Miranda the word that Flor and his men were ready to attack Naga. Nasaan ba si Miranda during these times? You might wonder. The day before, he was actually at a wedding. So baka may hangover pa from the partying the previous night. No? May kasalan sa Kanakman na inattendan yung mga TVGU. So by May 1, they were the TVGU members were surprised that Flor and his company were already ready to attack. So this is a map of Naga, present-day Naga City. So you will see here strategic locations. May mga tulay dito sa, this is Mabolo. Nakikita niyo yung Mabolo, may tulay dyan, di ba? Tapos Tabuco, there's also a bridge there. And then you have this bridge here sa may Igualdad Interior. And there's also another bridge sa unahan ng San Francisco. So according to multiple accounts, especially Barameda, dito nakaposisyon yung mga Hapon in defending Naga. So yung Mabolo Bridge, Puente de Naga, as well as Colgante Bridge. Colgante, it means hanging bridge, because it was literally a hanging bridge during that time. And it's also the same bridge that collapsed in 1972. If you're familiar with that, yung Peña Francia Fiesta, fluvial procession, I think Marcos was about to declare martial law in 1972, nagiba yung Colgante Bridge dahil sa dami ng tao. Now, the Camp Isarog guerrillas were accompanied by a few Aita Bomen. So ito na yung sinasabi ko na kahit yung indigenous peoples may kinalaman at may involvement sa resistance movement against the Japanese. And they advanced into Naga through the Colgante Bridge, through the hanging bridge near the Episcopal Palace. So yun yung inuna nila, no? That is now present-day Peña Francia Avenue. It was called Calle Villa Gaines back then. So Camp Isarog received reinforcements from the TVGU in the late afternoon. Mga alas 4, alas 5 na nakarating yung TVGU dahil nga late na rin nalaman ni Miranda, no, na susugod na yung Camp Isarog sa Naga. This is a better picture of Naga. So you will see here the bridges that I was talking about. The bridge that you see there, the very first bridge that you will see, that is the Tabuco Bridge. So may Japanese defense dyan. Yung bridge na nasa gitna, ito yung Panganiban Bridge present day, pero tinatawag siyang Puente de Naga during that time. And dun sa likuran, medyo faint na, hindi nyo na makikita yung itsura ng bridge. But if you zoom in, there's actually a hanging bridge there, and that's Colgante Bridge. Now, I was so surprised to find this picture on Wikipedia, so Wikimedia Commons, and this is actually from the National Archives of the US na ginawa ng public domain. So you can download the high-resolution version of this picture. So sumugod yung kampo ni Flor doon sa Colgante Bridge, yung hanging bridge. Dahil doon pinakamahina yung depensa ng mga Hapon. Obviously, itong Panganiban tsaka yung Tabuco, mas malakas yung depensa dyan dahil these are concrete bridges na pwedeng dumaan yung mga sasakyan. No? So they were heavily guarding this one, but heavily forgetting the hanging bridge near the cathedral. The cathedral is somewhere here, nasa top portion ng picture, no? And the Episcopal Palace as well. So this is a better view of the picture. Very nice picture. So on the second day of fighting, May 2, 1942, more guerrilla units from Naga's neighboring towns and barrios swept into the town, into Naga, including Hernandez's unit from Cabusao. So you see there Cabusao. Cabusao is right there by San Miguel Bay. Felix Espiritu and his men from Camaligan, it's just an adjacent town. And a group from Mount Isarog in Carolina, which is now a barangay here in Naga, and an upland barrio, which is led by Ricardo Gordenker. So ito yung mga units na nag-converge pa sa Naga mismo nung May 2. The guerrillas successfully captured Naga, but both the TVGU and Camp Isarog guerrillas suffered significant casualties, including Cecilio Bimeda and a certain Lieutenant Alpapara of Iriga. So maraming namatay on the part of the TVGU and the Camp Isarog guerrillas during the two-day skirmish here in Naga. Yung hindi nakikwento dito ay yung kwento ni Mariano Villafuerte. That's a very familiar name because we have another Villafuerte as governor of Camarines Sur. But Mariano Villafuerte Sr. was the father of Luis Villafuerte, former governor, minister ni Marcos, naging congressman ni Marcos, lahat na, no? Si Congressman Luis Villafuerte. So yung kwento sa kanya, nung May 2, nakakulong sila sa provincial capital, pero tumakas sila later that day kasama yung mga Japanese soldiers, yung mga aide niya, and Mayor Crisini of Iriga. Sila kasi mga collaborators. So syempre pinag-iinitan sila ng mga guerrillas, no? Tangkong Baka, and also the Camp Isarog guerrillas. So tumakas sila papunta doon sa direksyon ng Calabanga. Kung nasan yung Calabanga, it's north of Naga City. And then eventually they went to Tinambak here. And then they sailed to a certain barrio there called Vito Siruma. Unfortunately, nagpapatrolya din doon yung mga guerrillas ni Wenceslao Vinsons because what they didn't know was there was already an attack going on in Daet. So Francisco Turco Buayes was already patrolling San Miguel Bay via Mercedes Camarines Norte. So hindi na foresee ng mga Villafuerte na dun sila actually masasalubong ng mga guerrilla sa Vito Siruma. It's a very beautiful place, yung Siruma. Nahuli sila doon. And according to multiple accounts, Mariano Villafuerte was executed by the guerrillas. And he was beheaded. And there were actually even eyewitness accounts in Naga, in Libmanan, in multiple towns that his head was paraded across town because it meant success for the guerrillas. No? So may mga ganong incidents din. Yung mga collaborators ay pinapatay ng mga guerrillas dito, at least in the experience of the Tangkong Baka and Turcos forces in Camarines Norte. Maybe again, Jeff can fill us in later about Camarines Norte. Mas inaral po ni Jeff yun, sir. So after the fall of Corregidor on May 6, many of the officers of Flor, yung Camp Isarog guerrillas, surrendered and followed General Jonathan Wainwright's orders to submit themselves to the Japanese. So sinunod nila si Wainwright. No? And then Miranda, on the other hand, and the TVGU retreated to the remote barrios of Camarines Sur because the Japanese eventually captured Naga after the fighting in Corregidor. They also sent reinforcements to Naga to recapture it. So they retreated to certain remote barrios and operated underground. And they fought on in the next 3 years until the Americans returned and Naga was liberated again in 1945. So si Wainwright, no, skinny yung kanyang nickname. So kitang-kita naman sa picture, he's a very skinny general. So this is a picture from Mr. Jose Fernando Obias, which was published in Jose Barameda's book In the Crucible of an Asymmetrical War in Camarines Sur. So it shows you the members of the guerrillas that recaptured Naga and liberated American interns on May 1st, 1942. Again, it was short-lived because the Japanese eventually recaptured Naga, but that's story for another time. That's a separate report altogether. So let's go back to Agoncillo. What explains his argument in volume 2 of The Fateful Years? Well, one may say that it might just simply be a simple oversight, baka hindi niya lang napansin, or local historians might be quick to judge that Agoncillo was too focused on, quote, the national scene, kaya hindi niya nakita yung ibang local histories. But those arguments are quite untenable because he actually presents pieces of evidence to show that there was already resistance from different parts of Luzon, Visayas, as well as may Mindanao ba doon? Parang wala masyado Mindanao. There was Visayas. My hypothesis, if not an observation, based on the cases I discussed, is this. What Agoncillo considered as, quote, active resistance may have included only those that have been either, number one, given guerrilla recognition by the US after the war, and or those who have or were inducted into the USAFE before the fall of Corregidor. This is just my hypothesis. You can always show me counterexamples. But according to the cases I examined, this is what is surfacing from that. No? Na baka yung kinoconsider niyang, quote, active resistance ay yung may recognition lang from the US at yung mga kasapi lamang sa USAFE. One piece of evidence to support that hypothesis is this. Now, there's a 1947 check sheet. This was signed by a certain, I think, Lieutenant Colonel Fain, if I'm not mistaken. Initials lang kasi yung pangalan niya, so I wasn't able to find out kung sino si Lieutenant Colonel Fain. But the Guerrilla Affairs Division mentions or resolves in one of the sections here in this check sheet that says it does not grant guerrilla recognition before the fall of Corregidor on May 9, 1942. Now, prior to this date, individuals were required to be inducted by an authorized personnel into the USAFE. Governor Ablan was not a member of the USAFE or authorized to induct members therein. Kaya rin sila hindi nabigyan ng recognition. So this may not be true for the Cagayan forces. So what explains that? Ayun, may counterexample na nga ako kagad eh. So ano yung explanation sa argument ni Agoncillo? Baka meron kayong hypothesis or observations. You can maybe share that with us later during the question and answer portion. But in conclusion, I'd like to reiterate that there had already been active resistance movements even before the fall of Corregidor. And we have seen that in the examples of Ablan, of Maduro, of Miranda in Naga, of Flor in Camarines Sur. There's also the faith headed by an American retired soldier. I'd like to end this presentation by saying that USAFE member or not, there's my remarks in my notes, recognized by the US or not, we also have to give due recognition to all those who organized, operated, and actively resisted before the fall of Corregidor, and to those who valiantly fought the Japanese, and for those who died fighting. After all, many of them fought to defend our country and restore the pre-war order they so desired. Maraming salamat po sa inyong atensyon at pakikinig at muli magandang umaga po sa lahat.